Hello there, Larry Kotlikoff. How are
Hey,
you?
Glenn. Very good, Glenn. How are you?
Doing well, thank you. Indeed, this is Glenn Loury at the Glenn Show at bloggingheads.tv. Back after a long hiatus, haven't posted in probably 6 weeks or something like that. And I'm here with Laurence Kotlikoff, who holds a chair in the economics department at Boston University and is an old and dear friend of mine, and a very knowledgeable economist, writes about public finance issues and public policy, tax policy, healthcare, social insurance, things like that, and knows what he's talking about, and has agreed to spend a little time with us this morning talking about economic policy in our time here in the United States. Thanks, Larry. Really appreciate it.
Hey, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yo, good to have you. Listen, reason I wanted to talk with you in particular, here we are now, I guess we're about 15 months into the Trump presidency. It looks to me, correct me if you see it differently, that the major accomplishment of the Trump administration in terms of legislative action, policy, by far, is the huge overhaul of the federal tax law that the Republican Congress managed to get through and that the president has signed into law, so-called tax reform.
Right.
Every time a Republican wants to extol the virtues of the young Trump presidency, this legislation is pointed to. And every time a Democrat wants to point out how bad things are under the Republican control of the federal government, they point to this legislation, Nancy Pelosi and so forth, tax cut for the rich, a giveaway.
Yeah.
And some of the left of center intellectuals, I think of Paul Krugman writing in the New York Times this morning, in fact, but he has written the same column many times over, pointing out that the tax cut is not going to do anything for workers. It's going to make inequality worse. It's been oversold. And you know a little something about this, so I wanted to get you to weigh in both about the effects of the law so far and also about what you see as its longer-term prospects in terms of impact on the American economy and the distribution of the benefits from economic activity in the United States. So what do you think?
Well, I think Paul and I differ on this. Actually, I debated Paul a couple weeks ago in New York on this very issue, and I think maybe I modified his view a little bit. Might have been different had we not had our discussion. But here's the deal: we have in the tax a very significant reduction in the incentive to invest in the U.S. Now, he's absolutely right that it's going to take a while for that to impact investment from our theoretical models and our computer simulation models. It takes a while. So it could be 4 or 5 years that it takes until it really has an impact on the economy's output and wages. And I've been at the forefront with other economists as a group in putting together a very large-scale model that simulates how much capital would come in from the rest of the world and how much more output we get, and how much higher wages we get. And I told him about that in the debate, and it's about a 5% increase, 5.5% increase, maybe over the next 5 or so years. Not every year, but in cumulative, in total, wages, if we look out 5 to 10 years, will be about 5.5% higher than would otherwise be the case. Now, that's not earth-shattering, but it's certainly better than nothing. So this is a tax bill that I give a B- grade to, not an A. It's not the bill that I would have written, or proposed. It's not the bill that other economists would have pushed for, but it does some good for the economy. It also is much more progressive than Paul's saying. It's highly regressive. The reality, I believe, is that it's actually no more regressive or progressive than the old tax system was. I have a paper with Alan Auerbach sitting on my website. It's called The New Tax Law, Winners and Losers. And we look very carefully at the progressivity of the new tax bill compared to the old tax bill. And we find that there's essentially no change in progressivity when you measure progressivity the way we economists do, which is in the form of average tax rates. So if you look at the top 1% and you do the calculations correctly, and doing it correctly is very differently from the way it's being done now in Washington by the think tanks, whether we're talking about the Tax Policy Center or the Joint Committee on Taxation or the Congressional Budget Office. Both the government and the private sector think tanks are the government agencies and the private sector think tanks are using a methodology that is not really appropriate for understanding progressivity. We can get into that. But anyway, if you do the calculations correctly, things look, the average tax rates for the rich and the poor decline by the same, to the same degree, so that the overall progressivity of the system really does not change. Now, the absolute, so basically you get about a 1.5% reduction in tax rates for the rich and the poor. So that means that if you're paying X, you're going to pay 1.5% less of X. Now, the rich are paying a whole lot more in taxes than the poor. So the absolute increase in the absolute savings, the absolute dollar amount of savings going to the rich is many times more than that going to the poor. So on that basis, you could say, well, this is a very regressive tax bill, that this very wealthy person like a Donald Trump received $100,000 from this, and a very poor person received $20. But as a percentage of their taxes, it was an equal percentage. So based on how we describe and discuss progressivity, which is in terms of tax rates, not tax amounts, the system is as progressive under the new law as under the old law.
Okay. Excuse me for interrupting, but just let me ask, because somebody out there is saying you don't spend percentages, you spend absolute amounts of money.
Right.
And then there's someone on the left who's saying that. So why are you snowing me with percentages? And someone on the right is saying the money doesn't belong to the government, it belongs to the person who earned it, so that the idea that every increment to the tax law has got to be measured in terms of the absolute impact on persons is the wrong idea, because the purposes of the tax law is not to redistribute income, but it's to raise revenues for the government. So those are two different kinds of objections coming from either side of the argument.
Yeah, but apart from the people on the left and the right, there's how economics has evolved to discuss progressivity, how we have evolved as a profession, as a science, to discuss inequality. I think fundamentally a different way of saying what I'm saying is that the share of total spending that the poor get to do and the rich get to do is essentially identical under the new law as it was under the old law.
Okay.
But because the government is taking in less revenue in total, the absolute spending of the rich goes up by more than it does for the poor. But their share of the total spending stays the same. So as we economists describe traditionally progressivity, it hasn't changed. But if you are focused on absolutes, if that's your measure of fairness, then things were very unfair before the tax bill, and they're very unfair today. Yeah, there's a lot of inequality. And of course, he's not making,
Okay, now I got that. Okay, so let me sum up what I think I've heard you say so far. You think the tax bill is not bad, but it's not great. You would have written it differently, and I'd like to know about that, but in a moment. You think that the net impact on wages of the tax reform the Republicans enacted last year will be a roughly 5% increase over some period of time, some number of years, 3, 5, 6, 7 years, that it will take to work itself out. You think that the impact on inequality is basically a wash. The rich are gaining more from the cuts, but they're also paying more in taxes, and the percentage impact on everybody pretty much is the same across the income classes. So what's Paul talking about, Paul Krugman?
Well, he might be talking in effect, he's saying, look, things are terribly unequal before this bill was passed. They should have done something to reduce the inequality in the economy. All you have to do is take a look at Trump's yacht and his tower in New York to understand the thing, and the beggar on the street right next to his building in New York to understand we have a horribly unequal society. And I was just in New York, and I just was actually saw that contrast. But did this bill make that inequality worse? Well, on certain measures, yes. On certain measures, on our scientific measure of progressivity, no. So Paul might be just complaining about inequality, which is fine. He might. I think he's also saying that the impact of this bill is going to be zero because today he wrote that Apple is buying back shares.
Right.
Now, corporations buy back shares all the time. They also issue new shares, so they sell and buy shares of stock. It may be that Apple has decided that they can't invest the money that they spent buying back the shares. In effect, they're taking money they could otherwise have invested in new Apple stores or a new production of iPhones or Macs or whatever, and they actually handed the money back to the shareholders. Now, Paul is saying that that's evidence that we're not going to have investment from this new tax bill. I think that's not evidence of anything like that, because what it means is that that money is going to be going to households who own the shares. It can be a lot, disproportionately rich people who will then take the money they just received in exchange for their shares and invest it in something else. They're not necessarily going to consume more because they had their shares bought back. They're just going to take the money and go invest in some other company, and that other company can then build factories or buy equipment and whatever. So Paul knows enough economics. He's a Nobel Prize winner to know that that's a fallacious argument. He does not have to resort to that kind of discussion to really interact with us in the public. It's really doing a disservice to the public.
Yeah, I agree with you, Larry. Let me slow you down for a minute, because I want to make sure not everybody's an economist. I want to make sure everybody stays with you. I hear you. I think you're making a really important point right now. An important point about the economics and an important point about Paul Krugman. I want both points to be understood. So, again, correct me if I say anything that's wrong, but okay, Apple, in Paul Krugman's column in New York Times this morning, is buying back shareholders' shares. And people should understand that when a company does that, the value of the company hasn't changed, but the number of shares outstanding has. So anyone who continues to hold a share of the stock is going to be owning something that's worth more now. So that's a way of increasing the wealth of stockholders.
Well,
hang on. Correct me.
I'm going to correct on that. So if Apple has some money and they go and buy back the shares that you have, let's say I'm Apple, I take some of our money and I just buy back your shares.
Right.
So there are now fewer shares outstanding, but Apple also has less money in the company because it's just handed out money to you. So the price per share won't necessarily change.
Oh.
It's just, remember? So it's just gonna move capital from this entity into that entity.
Okay, no, I get it. I was wrong. What I said was wrong. I get it. All right. Price of outstanding shares doesn't change, but money in the hands of the people who have sold the shares to Apple is now going to go somewhere. Right. And the fact that Apple didn't spend it themselves but handed it over to their shareholders doesn't mean that it won't redound in terms of increased investment for the economy. That was the main point.
Ultimately, you're the owner. Think of it this way, Glenn. You own capital under the auspices of Apple, and now you've decided, in effect, to put it into General Electric. That's it. You've taken your money and you've moved it from Apple to General Electric.
Or I might consume some of it too, right?
Well, not really, because your consumption should not depend on whether or not you've got.
My wealth is in the form of Apple or General Electric or anything else. Okay.
Yeah, it's really that's
okay. So I think me, the economist, am finally getting it. It's merely the name of the person who will be investing the money that has changed, nothing else. That person had been Apple Corporation, and it's now Glenn Loury, shareholder of Apple Corporation, who has money instead of Apple shares. But I'm still going to hold it somehow in General Electric or in government debt or whatever.
if we really look deeply through this, it was you who decided to put the money in Apple. Now it's you, the shareholders, decided to put it. You, the investors, decided to put it over here. So to say that Apple did this as opposed to the shareholders telling Apple to do it, it's just a matter of language. You could have just said to Apple, "Give me back here. I'm selling you my shares. You're working for me. Just give me the money. Take those shares, rip them up. I'm going to put the money in GE because I know you guys don't have anything good to do with that money right now. But I think GE can make better refrigerators, and of course GE, is having trouble right now. So maybe they do need to produce some new products. But yeah. So I think this is the first order mistake Paul is making, and it's something that many people on the left have been making repeatedly for many months now in talking about the tax bill. I want your viewers to know that I'm not a Republican or a Democrat. I'm just like you, agnostic, and I think that politicians are basically lower life forms. And that I think any economist who really aligns himself or herself with a political party is really ripping up their economics license, because you cannot be both an economist and say, I believe in the economics of a political party, because you're then stuck with what they're saying. You have to defend it, and you can't think on your own. So you've given up your right to be an academic, to be an intellectual, to be a scientist. So you might, and Paul has unfortunately done that. He's ripped up his economics card, and that's why he feels free apparently to write things that are not, consistent with economics, that are really political statements, not economic statements, far too often. And well, that's where things are.
Okay, good. That's a commentary on the nature of discourse in public that draws on scientific expertise and the temptations, the seductions that are possible to corrupt we scientists when we engage in political discussion, because political discussion isn't bound by the same rules of consistency, rigor, reference to evidence, logical, coherence and such like that. And in this particular case, we're talking about the benefits of tax reform for the American economy and the fact that wealthy corporations who are getting the benefit of some of the changes in the tax law. And I want to know something about the details of those changes. How is it that Apple comes to be bringing money back from overseas and has funds in hand to purchase back its shareholder shares? But in any case, we're talking about how economists think about the consequences of these changes. And you're much more sanguine about it than many people. And you attribute that to the fact that you're above the political fray, that you're not an ideologue. You just got your green eye shade on, looking at the numbers and calling them the way you see them.
Well, I would say a B- is not a high grade. So let me just talk about that. I mean,
okay.
What we did is we raised the incentive to invest in the U.S., which I think was disproportionately low. We were operating with a what's called a marginal effective tax rate on investing in the U.S. that was too high compared to other countries. So lowering that was better. But in the process, what the tax bill did was gave away a lot of money to companies and therefore shareholders, effectively, for free. They could have lowered the effective tax rate on investing in the U.S., raised the incentives for investing in the U.S. without a giveaway. Now,
how's that? Wait a minute, I'm not following that. What's the giveaway, and how could it have been avoided?
Well, suppose you're a company and you have invested in the past, and you're not going to do any new investing, and what the government does is cut your tax rate. Well, that's great for you and your shareholders. They get a bonanza. You're not actually going to do any more investing. Now, some other company that is going to invest, they do have a better incentive to invest without giving you the bonanza. So we have great inequality in the U.S. We could have used this as an opportunity to reduce the inequality, made our tax system more progressive. I'm saying we kept the progressivity where it was, We should have improved progressivity, but more important, or equally important, we should have raised tax revenues. This country is entirely broke when you look at the long-term picture. We have obligations that are off the books that are out the wazoo, and we need a path of revenue that's much higher than what we are going to be getting. And what they did here is, if anything, lower that path of revenue, and that's leaving an even bigger tax bill for our kids to pay.
Okay, so what would you have? Yeah, I'm sorry. Let you finish. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, just to summarize, we needed to make the tax system more fair, give people better incentives to invest in the U.S., give people better incentives to work, and also get more revenue. Now, we could have done all those four things had I been elected president and had we passed the bill that I wanted to pass, but that didn't happen.
No, it didn't.
So there are better tax reforms out there that I and other people, or even Paul, would have come up with. So this is not a great accomplishment of the Republicans.
Okay. So I want to know about this. More fair, more revenues, more incentive to work, more incentive to invest. How are you going to do all that at the same time?
Well, you have to shift the tax system towards. I'll just give you one example. You could have on incentives to invest in the U.S., you could have lowered, rather than lowering the corporate tax rate, which was at 35% down to 21%, the nominal corporate tax rate, you could have just gone to 100% investing, 100% expensing on new investment of all kind. So you could have said, look, anybody who wants to invest here, you can get a write-off immediately on all your investment. Now that would have given everybody the same a better incentive to invest in the U.S. Pretty much the same incentive as under the new bill, but it would not have given a bonanza to companies that were not investing. They were just reaping in the profits from prior investments.
Okay, good.
They're getting a lower tax rate on the revenue that it's arising from past investments, not new investments. So we want to incentivize new investment, not reward old investment. That's stupid. And that's just a giveaway to people that don't need the extra money. And that's where, so had you not done that, we would have had the same incentive to invest in the U.S., but also more progressivity than what we actually ended up with. So that's what, almost every economist.
But not more revenue.
Well, yeah, it would have been more revenue because we would have given away, there would not have been this freebie that produced no extra investment. It's just a pure giveaway. If you have a company that's not doing any new investing and they were going to be paying on their stream of profits 35%, now they're paying 21%, it's just a giveaway to their shareholders. And that will lead them, to more, that will lead to less progressive, that's less fair, and we're going to have less revenue, and we could even have more consumption as a result, and it depresses the investment that we could otherwise have. So this was a very poorly designed tax reform. That's why I give it a B-. But to say it's not an F, and a lot of people have been saying it's an F, and a lot of people are saying it's an A+. It's a B-.
Now, what about incentives to work? You mentioned that. How is that reflected poorly in the current legislation, and how would you have done it differently? Incentives to work.
Yeah. Well, I think we have to, on the incentives to work, we have to look at the overall fiscal system. We have something like 30 major federal and state fiscal programs, tax schedules, if you like. Think about food stamps. You don't think about that as a tax system, right? But if you earn too much money, you start losing 23 cents on the dollar in food stamps. Think about the earned income tax credit, which is part of the personal income tax. Earn extra money, you lose 22 cents on the dollar. What about paying the FICA tax, the payroll tax? Every extra dollar you lose 15 cents on the dollar. So what about state income taxes? They are in Massachusetts around 5%. There's state sales tax around 5%. So if you take somebody who's poor, working, let's say at McDonald's, earning $20,000 a year, or maybe $15,000, they're in a situation where they're in a marginal tax bracket that's extremely high. It can easily be 60%. Then you add on the fact that they might be getting Medicaid. So if they earn too much money, they're going to lose their Medicaid. Or if they go into Obamacare, if they're on Obamacare, if they earn extra money, they can lose 15 cents on the dollar in Obamacare subsidies. So when you put all this stuff together, we have a tax system that's locking the poor.
Sorry about that.
Sure. We have a fiscal system, tax transfer system, that's just crazy because we have all these different provisions, different institutions that were put together without any coordination, without looking at the overall picture. So I would fix all that by radically changing the fiscal system in all its components. For example, universal health insurance. For example, progressive consumption tax that kicks in above $100,000 of consumption. For example, a value-added tax. For example, getting rid of the personal income tax entirely.
Okay, let me just stop you for a minute because there's a lot on the table here. Food stamps, Medicaid, earned income tax credit. Right. I get it that these are, in effect, tax programs on the poor in the sense that people's benefits go down if their earnings go up because they no longer qualify for the transfers. And that discourages them from working and earning more because the net return to them from work is reduced when you take into account the impact on their access to benefits. I get that. What I don't get is how you square the circle of fairness and revenues, because it seems to me the only way around that is either not to make the transfers in the first place, or to make the transfers not conditional on the incomes of people. The first seems to cut against fairness because it deprives people of the benefits, and the second seems to significantly increase the cost of the program because it means that a lot more people are going to be drawing food stamps who wouldn't be drawing them before if I don't taper off the benefit as their earnings rise. So what's wrong with the logic of that?
Nothing wrong. Good questions. If you shift the tax system onto taxing wealth, think about a value-added tax replacing the progressive income tax, and also having an extra progressive consumption tax on people that do a lot of consumption, on the rich. So that in effect taxes their wealth, because one of the reasons, one of the ways that the rich pay for consumption, well, the way is out of their wealth. So if you tax consumption, you're in effect taxing the wealth of the rich. So that's an example. What about the taxes associated with earning more money and losing your health insurance or health insurance subsidies? Well, if you have a universal voucher plan, Medicare Part C for all, that's part of Medicare. You can be in one of two different types of programs. One of them you get a voucher, and I would like to see that for the entire country. It's not exactly Bernie Sanders' plan. He's into traditional Medicare for all. I'm into Medicare Part C for all, which is actually the Republican part of Medicare. So that would give everybody a health insurance, and yeah, we'd have to pay for it, and we'd have to pay for it with our tax system. But people would not face any taxes at the margin they wouldn't lose their health insurance if they earn more money. So what I'm talking about here, Glenn, is shifting the tax burden onto wealth indirectly through a consumption tax, getting rid of, if you look at the different types of transfer programs, health insurance, giving universal health insurance, yeah, that's expensive. But the way I'm structuring it, it would be more expensive in the short run, less expensive in the long run. So over time, it would be much more affordable than what we now have. If you look at countries like Canada, they don't have the perfect system, or the UK, but they're not being driven broke by their health insurance system, and everybody's got coverage. That's kind of what I'm moving to in my proposal, but it still has government payment, but for private provision, competition. So think about food stamps. I would provide food stamps on a food distribution basis in schools, free schools in low-income neighborhoods, in free food 3 times a day to kids in schools in low-income neighborhoods, and food distribution centers in low-income neighborhoods, so that we don't tie getting food when you need food to working. So in each of these areas, so I've designed, I ran for president as a write-in candidate, and the press were not interested. They were much more interested in Donald Trump because of all his all his great talents and great ideas. So, but if you look at my website, kotlikoff.net, there's a book called "You're Hired: A Trump Playbook for Fixing America's Economy." I wrote this for Trump. I took my platform and I turned it into this book that's free on my website. It's 100 pages, but it lays out a bunch of simple plans, postcard length, for fixing all these different institutions. So in the end, everybody's facing a 30% marginal tax on working. Rich, poor, middle class, and we still have progressive. We have more progressivity, more revenue, and we don't drive our kids broke. So you can actually fix things even though we're in a tough situation, because we dug ourselves a very big hole for the last 6 decades under both types of administrations, Republican and Democratic. But there are better solutions. There's engineering that works better. If you think about the Charles River, right, in Cambridge and Boston, we could have politicians try and design a new bridge across the Charles River, or we could have engineers. In economics, we've had the politicians designing the bridges. It's time for the economists to design the bridges, because we can do a much better job. We've actually thought about what to do.
Okay, I'm persuaded, being an economist, by that, and people certainly should go to your website and they should look at your book. And I get what you're saying about how fundamental and radical restructuring of the overall fiscal system, or the set of systems that are interacting with each other, taxes on corporate earnings, taxes on individual income, transfer programs of people, provision of social services like Medicare, and support for the hungry and so forth. Radically redesigning and reconceiving those systems can be done in a way that enhances both fairness and the incentives that people need in order to work and save and produce and invest. So I get that. On the politics part, though, you say we should defer to the experts. And yes, expertise is of extreme value. But politics is a different kettle of fish. It requires passionate persuasion of people, moving them. You have to move them. You didn't get elected president, and you have a green eye shade that is just as sophisticated as anybody's. Okay, your models are real serious, frontier, state-of-the-art kinds of analytical models. But getting people out off their couches, getting them to a rally, moving them, Larry, that's not your forte, man. And that's what it takes to govern a country. That's what politics is. So I'm trying to make the argument that there's something in the political vocation that's of value, that is complementary to the expertise that the scientists can bring, and one has to marry those two things somehow. You can't just simply by force of reason move a nation of 300 million people to do things differently. You have to tell them stories. There has to be a narrative. It's somehow got to get to them at a visceral level. No?
No, absolutely. If I had a lot of money and maybe a different personality, I'd be, you might be talking to the president right now. Certainly, if I had a lot of money, we would have had a different election, because the press would have paid attention, and then I think other people would have come along. Charisma, I don't know. Charisma is a difficult thing to produce. I don't know how that rises, but one thing I know is that a lot of people are looking for the truth. A lot of people in the middle are looking for somebody who's not, who's explaining that actually the real problem here is with our kids, taking care of our kids and making sure that they're going to be okay, and that we're actually stealing from them and endangering them on all sorts of fronts, including climate, including nuclear proliferation, including the fiscal system, and including the educational system and the immigration system. All these things are impacting our kids and therefore what we care about the most. So if anybody had talked to the people in those kinds of terms, maybe charisma would not have mattered so much. Maybe people would have just connected to what they actually fundamentally are supposed to care about, which more than anything in the world, they're kids.
Okay, well, speaking of our kids, I assume you have in mind, at least partly in mind, the deficit, the federal deficit, and the long-term fiscal prospects of the government. I know that you're not one of these people who simply looks at current flows of money into and out of the federal fisc and decides that this is good or bad. You want to take a long-term view. But I also think I know that your view, your understanding when you do take a long-term view is really quite pessimistic and alarmist. That you think that the federal government is basically bankrupt. And I don't imagine that the last iteration on the tax policy that the Republicans enacted changes that scenario. My impression is that during the Obama administration, the federal debt conventionally measured doubled practically. So it looks like both parties are practicing fiscal policy at the federal level that is inconsistent with the long-term, coherence of the federal budget. Is that your view? And what would you do about that?
Well, I think it's, economics is very clear. Our science is very clear that we can't look at current cash flows because they're not well defined. What the government puts on the books and off the books just determines what it reports as its cash flows, and that those numbers are really meaningless. So the entire economics profession, you included, Glenn, believe we need to do what economic theory says to do, which is to look at our long-term fiscal picture in terms of what we call fiscal gap accounting. Look at the value of the entire path of outlays as projected by the government, get the value in the present, form the value of all those outlays as a present value, as a value right now. Compare that with the present value of all the taxes. You look at the CBO's projections, you do that calculation of the fiscal gap, you see that we're short $197 trillion based on the most recent CBO projections, long-term projections. Now that's 10 times US GDP. That's 10 years of output. So our country is not just broke, it's completely insolvent. We're beyond broke. We're probably in worse shape, from what I can tell, than Greece, Russia, Japan, any country that, Japan's got problems because they're significantly aging.
Yeah.
And Italy actually has a negative fiscal gap, according to the calculations the European Council has done, because Italy's got a pension system that's had 4 reforms to it. It doesn't have a social security system that's, in terrible shape. It's got a $34 trillion fiscal gap on its own, as part of the $200 trillion fiscal gap of the country. That's what we have. They don't have that problem in Italy. They don't have a healthcare system that's out of control in terms of future spending. So their off-the-book expenses, debts, are much better than our off-the-book debts. Their on-the-book debts are much worse as a share of GDP, but the overall picture in Italy is actually much better than any other European Union country. According to the European Union itself, they put out a report called the S2 indicator recently, and certainly far better than the U.S. They're actually in the black. They've got a fiscal gap that's negative, not a positive fiscal gap that's 197 trillion large, and as I said, 10 years of GDP. So there are, so we have big problems. The Republicans are not acknowledging this. The Democrats aren't acknowledging this. Everybody is trying to expropriate the next generation in order to get reelected, and that's a terrible scene. And I think this picture, and I think it has to do with the heterogeneity of our country. I mean, we may have discussed this before together. The fact that older people don't see younger people look differently than their kids as their kids.
Yeah.
They're different colors, they're different.
I get it.
All this ethnic differences. So we got a problem here. We have to pull together as a country. We have to talk about the fact that our kids are everybody else. And unless we have that conversation, we're going to head the way of Argentina, which is spent 100 years going downhill and went from being a highly developed country to a developing country again, and may never recover.
Yeah, yeah. Now, I thought Paul Ryan, one of the things that he talked about, he might not have been doing anything about it. Paul Ryan, the Speaker of the House, who's stepping down now, was the insolvency implications of our fiscal commitments through social programs, Social Security and Medicare, to be precise, and the fact that they're not viable over the longer term and need fundamental restructuring. Am I wrong about that?
No, I know, and I've talked a lot with Paul about these issues, so he's aware of them. But the way he framed them, the Republicans framed them, is we have a terrible long-term, we have a big fiscal problem. They're not really revealing how big it is and how much they, particularly George G.W., contributed to the problem, but in recent years. But they're also saying, well, the way to fix things is just to shut down programs like, help for the, like Medicaid, reduce it, don't expand it, reduce or eliminate Obamacare. So their idea is, well, we don't actually have to help poor people. We can live with inequality. That's the society. To get back to a fiscally sustainable situation, we can just forget about a good segment of society and let them fend for themselves. Well, that's not a solution that the public really wants. I think fundamentally people understand that we're in this together, and we have to have, we can't have beggars on the street, people sleeping on the street, and we can't leave people with a broken arm and not get them to the hospital, even if they can't afford it.
Sure.
We have to be humane. So there's got to be. So what he was proposing was not an answer. It's not an answer to say we're going to save the country fiscally by cutting the spending on poor people. That's not an answer.
Okay. Let me ask you one. We're kind of running out of time here. I got a question came up in one of my classes I was teaching to graduate students here at Brown the other day. So to make a long story short, we were studying this technical paper on optimal regulation of monopoly firms, and the authors had made an assumption about the relative value to society of $1 in the hands of consumers and $1 in the hands of corporations. And the authors wanted to weight $1 in the hands of corporations at a rate alpha, somewhere between 0 and 1, relative to $1 in the hands of people. And a student asked, why is alpha less than 1? That is, why would a social planner call $1 in the hands of a consumer more valuable to society than $1 in the hands of a corporation? Since he said, aren't corporations merely legal fictions that are kind of where contracts between workers, consumers, and the providers of capital are nested? Aren't corporations people too? This kid was saying in so many words. This is what Mitt Romney famously said during the 2012 presidential campaign that was used so brilliantly against him. Corporations are people too. And I thought about that for a moment, and I said, well, you have a point. After all, there is no such person as a corporation, but when the dollars flow into the corporation, they don't simply sit there. They flow out either to the people who own the corporation, who are pension funds and individuals, as well as to indirectly the customers of the corporation through the consumers markets and the factor suppliers to the corporation, the laborers and the people who sell the corporation the inputs that end up getting fashioned into the final product. So why is there a corporate income tax separate from the taxation on people more generally? And why do we care about the relative amount that corporations are paying as compared to individuals, when at the end of the day, corporations are only legal fictions that are the context within which individuals are interacting with each other?
Well, yeah, I agree with the thrust of what you're saying, which is corporations are not people, and we really should not be trying to think about taxing them as opposed to taxing the people that we have a country. We're trying to generate certain services for the public and redistribute it from the rich to the poor, and that's what we're trying to do. We're not trying to go after some entity called a corporation, which is owned by people and hires people. So under my tax reform, I eliminate the corporate tax entirely. I just say, look, what we really want to do is tax consumption on a progressive. That's what we really care about. Inequality is about these people get to consume a whole lot more than these people. So, and ultimately, we want to tax consumption and do it in a progressive manner. So that's the essence of my tax reform. So I 100% agree with the student who said that this is just a form. We're missing the bigger picture, which is if you give some legal entity some money to do something for you, that legal entity is not a person. It's not, you got to worry about, you got to think about who's ultimately getting to consume here. That's really what we care about in the end. And are we consuming as a group of people too much relative to our kids? That's another issue. So we got to issue a fairness within a generation in terms of consumption, but also fairness across generation when it comes to consumption. Now, let me just say one last thing, which is I think we have, when it comes to corporations, when I think about corporations and their actions, I think we have too much monopoly in our country relative to where we were in the past. I haven't heard of any major antitrust initiative by any administration in recent decades. We should not have. I think Amazon probably should be broken up because it's got too much power, so we need competition, and then we have a fair playing field. But these big companies like Facebook that have the first mover advantage, that is leading to a network situation where it's very difficult for somebody to come in and compete. So that's where the antitrust division of the Justice Department needs to come in and actually do their job. That's another thing I would have done as president. So I don't know whether actually good policy can outweigh bad charisma, but I think enough good policies, it might actually be charismatic.
Well, you're not alone, Larry. I mean, I'm thinking just a few days ago, Eric Posner and Glenn Weil had a piece in the New York Times calling attention to the problem of latter-day monopoly power in these large corporations in the tech sector, but not only there, and saying that, in analogy to the progressive era and the robber barons at the turn of the 20th century, and the way in which we developed institutions in the antitrust division of the Justice Department, as well as in the Federal Trade Commission, and so forth, anti-monopoly, that we needed a 21st century version of that to deal with some of these concentrated market power problems.
Plus why, and just to add to that, why should Facebook or Google be able to grab my my data for free? If they want to invade my privacy, let them pay for it. Let them ask me if they want to give them permission, and let them pay me for where I go, what website. I mean, I just
Well, the short answer is they don't have to pay you because you're willing to give it to them for free.
Well, it's because they are a network and they have connections with other people that I need to be connected to.
Correct.
So they're exploiting that monopoly power, that first mover advantage, which was not theirs. They got in there before everybody else. They're robber barons. They robbed the connections, the connectivity, and that's not theirs as some result of some actual invention. That was just by luck.
Yeah, that's something we ought to discuss further on another occasion, Larry. Thanks for coming on the Glenn Show. Very informative. I appreciate it very much. So thank you.
Always great, Glenn. Talk to you soon.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Okay, Larry.